finally, we have Danny Dorling. Danny is Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford, and he's also described modern Britain as the most unequal society since the 19th century, and argues in this book that we can no longer afford the super rich. Danny.
I'll just start by saying a little bit about immigration and racism. A few years ago, with some colleagues, we decided to try to work out where was the community in Britain which had had the biggest influx of immigrants and who were they. So we looked at the census and we found that the biggest influx of immigrant children, children born in another country, was around Hyde Park. And the most common country of birth of the children around Hyde Park, if you feel like stopping a child around Hyde Park and trying to guess where they were born, was the United States of America, because these were the children of bankers and children of the very rich who settled around there. This kind of immigration to Britain, I've got nothing particularly against this. I just wish people would assimilate and not bring their American values with them when they come. But this kind of immigration of the extremely rich is largely unopposed, and you can see it in the Sunday Times rich list. The Queen used to be number 5 or something. Now, and of course she's an immigrant as well, or not far off one. Now she's way down, and who's above her? It's all immigrants. And we never talk about the immigration of people with a lot of money, and we never ever talk about where they got their first million. You're not allowed to ask where people who've got a lot of money got their first million. Just a word on flags. There's a lot of optimism amongst people I work with on inequality, which may seem odd to you because you're looking a bit depressed at the moment. And one reason there's a lot of optimism is because a lot of these people have been working on inequality for 20 or 25 years. And for the majority of the time that they were talking about these issues and inequality was widening, the gaps were getting bigger, it was getting worse, nobody was listening. Whereas since 2008 there has been the most remarkable increase in attention about this problem. Now, you may well say it's not enough, it's not getting us anywhere, it's terrible. But if you can cast your minds back, and I'm just doing a demographic survey of your ages here, in 2000 or in 1990, it just wasn't there as a major issue. It is now there as a major issue for fairly obvious reasons. And in some ways, the time and the sentiment is changing. We tend not to celebrate the very rich anymore. Our newspapers do not show young bankers quaffing champagne, paying $30,000 for a bottle in some cases, as they did in the past. We still celebrate celebrities, but they have to try and pretend that they don't have that much money and they're normal. And if they have a go about not wanting to pay the mansion tax, if we had a decent politician, it wouldn't be very hard to shout them down and tell them how many babies die because of lack of proper incubators, because people like them are not paying their taxes. And one point on flags, just to give you an idea about how far the world's changing. In the last year I've moved south back to where I grew up in Oxford, and there's been a big thing about flags in Oxford. And the big thing about flags in Oxford has been about, can you put up the rainbow flag? And when one college decided that the rainbow flag couldn't fly above it, what happened? Dozens and dozens of students flew the rainbow flag from their windows. There has been lots of changes which are worth noting and celebrating. Things are happening. I'm very glad you started with Scotland, because the thing which has done the most for my confidence in the last year is spending just 3 days in Scotland before the referendum and talking to people, and I just asked them one question. I asked them, how many people do you now know who you didn't know a year ago, that you've met, that you can name? And it had doubled. In most cases it had doubled or tripled. I didn't know who all these names were. This was a debate within Scotland. But people's social circles had expanded massively. And something dramatic has happened there and continues to happen. So if you're getting depressed about what is possible and what it might take for things to happen, I mean, that was an incredibly close vote. 5.5% of people voting a different way, the City of London would have crashed the next day. That's what would have happened. We'd have had a sterling crisis because we suddenly have a crappy little currency, not even backed up by oil, the day after. It was 5.5%, it was extremely close. And the left groups that helped organise this, what did they come out of? They came out of the mess of the jailing of Tommy Sheridan. I mean, you know, they were hardly particularly well organised, you know, a few years earlier than this. So it's remarkable what is possible. But let me get on very quickly to what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is inequality in the 1%. And this is another reason, I think, to be hopeful. For almost all the last 100 years, the 1% and a group directly beneath them, the rest of the 10%, had travelled together. When they lost their fortunes and they lost their wealth from 1914 all the way to 1978, the 1% came down, they had to give up their big houses and so on, and the rest of the 10% came down with them. And they became dramatically equal in the 1970s. For large European countries, the only one which was more equal than us was Sweden in the 1970s. We had a narrower income distribution than France and Germany. And one problem on the left is we don't celebrate it and we don't tell a different story of the 1970s and what it was like to live in the 1970s, which is not the story which is largely told by people in the media now who tend to come from a very small group who are very resentful of having lost their wealth by then. From the 1970s onwards, the 1% became richer and richer and richer, and the rest of the 10% became richer with them. And when you have that, you have a group at the top large enough to win a majority of elections, to control society. And you have a group you can try to get into if you're aspirational. It's not unrealistic to try to get into the top 10%. But since 2008, that pattern which has lasted for a century has fractured. The 1% have carried on getting richer, doing better. But the rest of the 10% have actually seen their incomes fall, and fall quite dramatically. Now this is before the worst of the cuts come in, but the IFS has shown that inequality amongst the 99% is now back down to 1990 levels. So you've got the split at the top, and that creates all kinds of confusion in British politics. It doesn't create confusion for the Conservatives, because they are and always have been the party of the 1%, and the 1% are doing well. But they need to win an election, and so they have a series of economic policies which are really geared to one thing, and that is keeping housing prices high, because that's what gets the Conservative vote out. But beneath people at the very top, which is landlords who are buying up more property, people who are sitting on piles who don't really have to worry about their wealth, there is increased precarity. And even if it isn't for those members of the rest of the 10%, they know their children are facing an incredibly uncertain future when they thought they had it sewn up. And it's very, very hard to run things when that is the case. Now you've got two separate patterns going on. I'll just be a couple of minutes. One is the slow and steady decline of the British Empire. And that's peculiar to us, and it's, you know, Scotland is getting close to the point of saying, as an almost fully co-opted member of this, we don't want out. That's one thing that's going on, and it's unique to us. The other is the widening inequality in wealth worldwide, and the two come together in a very strange way. We don't talk about the last world power before us. You're not taught what it is. You know the USA has taken over. People worry that China, or might celebrate that China might be next, but nobody says who was it before England, before Britain. It was the United Provinces, small part of the Netherlands, which has now become a rather normal European state. So there is a future when you're no longer a world power, but we don't talk about how we get there. We're trying to avoid getting there. There's a desperate attempt to not become a normal country. And how do we do this? Because it's scary. There are all kinds of things that we do that people in the rest of Europe don't do. People in the rest of Europe, by and large, send their children to local schools, state schools. Might be slightly posher state schools, this isn't utopia, but there's a whole load of things that we do that other people don't do. So it's hard work becoming normal, but we're partly engaged in the process of becoming normal. One way in which we're trying to avoid becoming normal is to be a treasure island, a place for the super rich of the world. The theory is that you can't have trickle down everywhere. Even people on the right realise you can't have trickle down everywhere. But can you have trickle down in one country? Can we have one place, the favourite place for the rich of the world to come, where we can be their cleaners and their butlers? We can provide universities for their children. We can provide schools for their children. If you like, one way of looking at Plan A is we'll be Treasure Island and we'll help the movement of money around the world and we'll skim some off on the way. The Tories, the plan isn't simply how can we stuff everybody else. It is a how can we stay great and have some crumbs so that the lower orders, the animals, don't starve, if you like. But that's the way I see it. I'm going to try to wrap up with one reason to be optimistic, which doesn't sound like a very good reason, but at least it tells you you're not going to have to sit through this for another 5 or 6 years. And it's a statistic which Russell Brand doesn't use, and which somebody needs to get to Russell Brand, because he's much better than I am at publicising statistics. And it's about the 1% richest people on the planet. Credit Suisse, the bank, do a very good job of trying to work out how much wealth the 1% richest people on the planet have. They try very hard to get it right because they want their allies and competitors to think they've got a list of these people, because that's a very valuable thing to own. Last year, in their World Wealth Report, they announced that the richest 1% of people on the planet had 41% of all the wealth of humanity. 41% last year. A month ago, the latest World Wealth Report came out, and the richest 1% had 48% of the wealth of the planet. There has never been a 12-month period in world history, never been a 12-month period in world history, where the best off 1% have increased their take by 7 percentage points. Now I know I'm a nerd, but I've got another minute to try to explain to you why this really matters. It's gone from 41 to 48 in 1 year. 7 more years of that and a couple of months, and the richest 1% will have 100% of all wealth in the world, and it's game over. Various reasons. What that should tell you, if you've ever played with these kind of statistics before, and they happen in other examples, is that it is not going to continue like this, because it cannot continue like this. And you are living through the most remarkable year and years right now, and something's going to happen. Can't tell you what's going to happen, how it's going to happen. But they're not going to take another 7%, another 7%, another 7% until they have everything within 7 years. That won't occur. I'll give you one other example of these kind of things that tell you something really odd's going on. A couple of years ago, Kensington and Chelsea, these very, very rich boroughs where they're digging underneath to break swimming pools so their children can drown in them. Why on earth you would want a swimming pool in a basement? Anyway, Kensington and Chelsea, one of the richest, most expensive places on the planet now. Life expectancy in the Royal Borough was going up by more than a year. For life expectancy, people who were living to 86 were suddenly living to 87.5 1 year later. 87.5, 89. The only way that can continue is if the residents of Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster become immortal. And this is reasons to be cheerful. Something extremely odd was happening. It was a clearing out of the poor, the bringing in of the super wealthy, but it isn't there forever. It's a last-ditch attempt to hold on to winning the global race and putting the great back in Britain, keeping Plan A, and for God's sake, whatever you do, keep house prices high up until May the 7th. Because the one thing that stops Conservative voters walking out and voting Conservatives is if their houses fall in value slightly. They sulk and they don't vote. So if you're trying to understand the conspiracy on the right, it really isn't a set of people meeting in yachts and planning a class war very, very carefully. Yes, they do hate people beneath them because they were brought up to do that, but if you saw George Osborne just trying to sit still on the benches at Prime Minister's Question Time last week, he's not the most capable man in the world. In the short term, it's all about that election, and for voters on the right, it's about trying to tell them that their wealth is safe until they vote. And for Labour, it's trying to address what they are told is people's biggest fears. And they've been told it by pollsters for the last 4 elections, apart from 2010. 2010 was the only election in which the economy went above immigration in terms of people's main concern on voting, because of the most almighty tanking of the economy. So Labour are in complete confusion and don't know what they're doing. The Tories have a plan, but it's a very shaky plan because it's quite hard to keep the highest house prices on the planet stable when people have stopped buying houses in London apart from landlords. It's all a mess, it's all to play for. We need to learn from the victories that have happened and not be too depressed about the degree of organisation it may take, because we're facing an incredibly disorganised future in a very short amount of time. Thank you very much.